So a Twitter thread made its way into my feed this morning, where essentially some user said that Tokyo Ghoul was good regardless of our opinions. Now the thread doesn't amount to very much, but it does address a few points which I think are paradigmatic of your average evaluation can be objective folk. I by no means want to send any hate to this user. I just want to take this as a perfect opportunity to discuss what I think are some really important issues around the evaluation of anime manga that I hadn't had an opportunity to discuss yet. I'll read the one part that I think is particularly relevant for what I want to talk about today. Art is subjective, but it has a thing called proper execution. It's not subjective. Everything a writer sets out to do, and if it's executed perfectly with very few errors from a neutral point of view, is the thing that makes a story amazing, regardless of how we feel about the story personally. Vice versa, we can love a story so much, even when the author is fumbling, but we have to admit it from a neutral point of view that the author is fumbling despite you liking it personally for whatever reason. There's always something that personal opinion can't affect, even in something subjective like fiction, because there's always a part of it which is objective. So, he says regardless of what you think about Tokyo Ghoul, it is still good, and we can tell that because we can adopt this neutral perspective, this neutral point of view that he mentioned a few times. So it's quite clear that he's invoking the objective/subjective distinction here. He's saying that we can have a subjective opinion on an anime or manga, but that does not change the objective quality that underlies our opinion. And that's a distinction that I've challenged time and time again on this channel, but I want to take this thread as a kind of case study as to what an objective view of evaluation could look like and the problems with it. So again, the kind of model he's working from within is this. He thinks that we may have our own individual opinions on an anime or manga, but that at the end of the day, there is this objective underlying quality which exists regardless of that subjective opinion we might have. This is more or less the popular position on the evaluation of art being objective. But allow me to offer another interpretation of what's going on, and let's see if this isn't more accurate to what we experience in the anime manga communities we find ourselves. I think that at bottom, when someone uses the term objective, they're using it because it invokes a special rhetorical force. Now what I mean by that is that when I say something's objectively good, I'm going above and beyond just calling it good. I'm saying it because I know this term implies a much stronger force than any of those other ways of describing it. But I think a better way to interpret how these people use the term objective is like this. When they say that something's objectively good, that's a signal that what they're calling good is especially good to them. And that last part is what's most important. It's signaling that this is something that they specifically value a lot. Because this feeling they have towards Tokyo Ghoul is so strong, they think that this feeling must be a reflection or the effect of some underlying objective cause, that is, Tokyo Ghoul's objective quality. And, if they're right, then this quality should also cause other people to feel the same way they do. But obviously, if we look into any anime manga community, Tokyo Ghoul has its fair share of haters. Now in this user's model, his way of explaining those haters is to say that they're simply wrong. He implies that they're biased time and time again by bringing up this idea of the neutral point of view, essentially saying that if you were to take on this point of view, you would see the same things that he does. And so obviously, if you don't think Tokyo Ghoul is objectively good, you just haven't taken that neutral point of view. You're biased in some sense. So just to make sure we're all on the same page here, this is what I think's going on for this user. They read Tokyo Ghoul and had very strong feelings towards it. And so they try to communicate those feelings by using the term objectively good, because they know that communicates a special kind of force. Because this feeling is so strong, they assume that it must be the effect of some underlying cause, that is, Tokyo Ghoul's objective quality. When they encounter people that have other opinions about Tokyo Ghoul, their response is to say that they haven't adopted the necessary perspective to see that underlying quality, and the implication, of course, is that they must be biased. Hence they lean so heavily on this idea of the neutral point of view. Now, the reason I argue that it's still all subjective is because, and this best describes why I think there are so many opinions about Tokyo Ghoul, or any anime or manga for that matter, it's because we each individually have certain criteria for what constitutes a good or bad anime and manga, or art in general. And Tokyo Ghoul just happened to satisfy all of his criteria in a way that made him feel as good as one could experiencing the medium. By contrast, those who dislike Tokyo Ghoul, well, Tokyo Ghoul just didn't offer them what they wanted out of a good anime or manga. So this is all to say that we all have our individual preferences towards what we like, and that's okay. But I've said all of this in other videos before, so instead of going down the same few lines of thought, let's look at things a little differently. I think what we have here is a good framework, or at least the seed of one, to develop what could be an objective view of evaluation in art. And the view that perhaps best fits what this individual is attempting to express is laid out in the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant's work, The Critique of the Power of Judgment. In the Analytic of the Beautiful, Kant attempts to lay out what he thinks is the principle of our judgments of taste. Now, it's impossible to do any cursory overview of any part of Kant's philosophy without doing it some great injustice, but today I'm just going to focus on what he has to say about the judgments of taste, and more specifically, judgments about what's beautiful. Now, I think for our purposes in this specific context, we'll take this idea of the judgment of beauty to be the same as a judgment regarding an anime or manga's quality. And Kant comes to 4 main conclusions about these judgments in this part of the book. The first conclusion, and the one that our Twitter user actively endorses, is this idea that a judgment of taste must be disinterested. Another way to put that is that you must be unbiased when making a true judgment of taste. When you're saying that something is good, according to Kant, you can't have any interest in the object. You can't seek to gain something out of calling it beautiful, or you can't be invested in it emotionally in some way. You have to be, in the words of our Twitter user, neutral. I think this is a fairly easy idea to understand, so let's leave it at that. The second conclusion that Kant comes to is that the object of a judgment of taste should please universally without a concept. Now that's a little more jargon heavy, but the basic idea is this. When you deem an object to be beautiful, what you're saying is that any other person who were to experience that object should come out with a similar feeling. So to put this into the language of our Twitter user, if you're going to read Tokyo Ghoul from a neutral perspective, then you should feel the exact same thing that he feels, universally. If you're disinterested, you will be pleased universally. And the fourth conclusion, which is related to the second, is that when you say that something is beautiful, when you say that Tokyo Ghoul is good, not only are you asserting that universally everyone who's disinterested should have that same feeling, but you're saying something stronger. According to Kant, at least, you're saying that there is a necessary connection to satisfaction. So again, assuming that you are going into Tokyo Ghoul from this neutral point of view, the idea is that there will be a necessary connection between your experience of that object and you being satisfied. And that is, in essence, what a Kantian view of objective evaluation in art would look like. Bastardized, but for our purposes, functional. The idea, once again, in short, is this. We should be disinterested. We shouldn't have any bias towards the object of evaluation. And assuming that we all take that perspective, anyone that takes that perspective will feel pleasure in the object, and this is necessary. To put it in more simpler terms, or in the terms that our Twitter user has laid out, if we adopt a neutral point of view, universally everyone will be pleased, and that's necessary. And so great, we have one of the biggest philosophers in the history of philosophy supporting a view espoused by, a 20-year-old on Twitter. So why would I ever want to argue against that? How could I argue against that? Well, for me and many other critics, it all falls apart from that first conclusion, this idea of disinterestedness, this idea of the neutral point of view. The problem with this is that it assumes you can enter a neutral point of view, but that's something I'd like to challenge. There's always unconscious forces acting upon you that predispose you towards liking or disliking certain things. These are unconscious subjective biases that we have zero control over, whether that be certain norms of interpretation that you've inherited from your society. You can just think of the countless examples of how common objects are interpreted in very different ways depending on which community you find yourself in. For a long time, the upside-down cross in pop culture was a symbol of Satanism or the devil and heavy metal, but in a lot of Christian circles, it's a sign of humility because, of course, St. Peter was, crucified upside down. He thought himself not worthy to be crucified in the same way that Jesus Christ had been. You can also think of other cultural norms, like how in many parts of the West, it's deemed impolite to kind of shout out at your waiter and you're supposed to wait for them to come to you, whereas in some eastern parts of the world, that's the norm. Given how busy things are, you just want to let your waiter know when you're ready to make things more efficient. And there are countless more examples of how we interpret things differently in different social communities. You also have to think about how your own unique experiences predispose you towards certain themes. If you've experienced the loss of a close family member, that very well could predispose you towards being more emotional to scenes that represent a similar subject matter. In a way, you might be more predisposed to loving that scene if it accurately portrayed how you felt than somebody with no experience in such a situation. So there is no shortage of how these individual experiences or social norms that we inherit predispose us towards some things more than others. And that is an unconscious, subjective bias. It's a bias that exists only in us, We're not aware of it, so we can't even consciously compensate for it. And even assuming that we were aware of these biases, who's to say we even have the mental power to really adequately compensate for these biases? It just seems unfeasible that we can quantify, our emotions or sentiment towards a show and then try to subtract some part of that away in an attempt to compensate for some bias. And because this objective view is premised on taking that neutral point of view or that disinterested perspective, everything else falls apart. Because even for Kant, if you couldn't be disinterested, then there's a chance that you might not have that pleasure. You might not have that necessary connection to satisfaction. Now, there is one other usage of the term good that is cited in this thread that I wanted to address, because it's one that I've heard many, many times. I'll repeat the specific passage. Everything a writer sets out to do, and if it's executed perfectly with very few errors from a neutral point of view, is the thing that makes a story amazing. So here the user is really leaning on this idea that if a mangaka has some goal and they achieve that goal, then the manga should be good. And this is something I hear quite often. People say, well, the mangaka intended for it to be this way, so it's not bad. But what is happening here? Well, we're essentially conflating two notions of goodness. Now, the main use of the term good, at least in communities that involve evaluating art, is to express the value one has towards some object of art. When I say Tokyo Ghoul is good, I'm essentially expressing my value of Tokyo Ghoul, my evaluation of it. However, there is another very popular usage of the term good, and it's what we might call a kind of functional understanding. And I'll put it to you this way. A good knife is one that cuts well. Now, how do we know that it's good? Because knives have a function. The function, or the purpose of a knife, is to cut things. And so a good knife is one that fulfills that purpose, that fulfills that function. Likewise, a bad knife is one that does not fulfill that function. So a bad knife, of course, is one that's dull because it can't cut. It can't perform its purpose. And I think what happens is people confuse these two terms. So if we look at a mangaka, for example, they have some intentions for a series. They say, I want to achieve X with this series. Then, over the course of the 200 chapters or so, they achieve exactly that. In the functional sense, yeah, that's a good mangaka because they have achieved their purpose. They have fulfilled what their function was, what their purpose was. Now, in one sense, yeah, this is a good manga because the mangaka stipulated some purpose for the manga that it achieved. However, some people then take that claim regarding the functional goodness of the manga and try to make a claim about its value, its quality, and say because the manga achieved what the mangaka wanted, it is therefore good in the sense of its quality. But if that's your sole criteria for determining what makes a manga good, we run into some pretty absurd cases. And so I ask you to consider this situation. You have a writer that wants to seem really smart to its readers. And so their intentions, their purpose with the book they're writing, is to make it as confusing as possible to give the illusion that they're some kind of super genius and that it's all the readers that aren't smart enough. And so the writer does that, and they achieve that function, they achieve that purpose. They wrote the story, it comes out, readers have no idea what's going on, but the writer achieved its purpose. So functionally, that's a good book. But to anyone reading it, it would seem quite odd to try and call that book objectively good. And I think this highlights the kind of discrepancy between the two uses of the term good. We can create something with some intention and then properly execute that intention, but if the intention's shitty, then the manga, the book, whatever, it's gonna be shitty. So yes, it's functionally good, it fulfilled its function, but that has nothing to do with its quality, with the value I give it. Anyways, that's all I had to say on this issue for today. I didn't put much prep into it, so I hope it wasn't too rambling and meandering. If you'd like to see more content like this in the future, don't forget to rate, comment, subscribe, let me know what you think in the comments below, and until next time, whenever that might be, peace and love, baby.